Thanks so much for joining us for today's webinar entitled Exploring the Next Frontier of Coastal Ocean Data Collection with the University of Western Australia. My name is Duncan McTavish. I am SoFar Ocean's sales lead for research and academic institutions. I'm joined today by Dr. Jeff Hansen and Dr. Michael Cutler from the UWA Oceans Institute. Jeff is an associate professor of earth sciences at UWA and has been there since 2013. Before that, he was a postdoctoral researcher at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute and received his PhD from the University of California, Santa Cruz. Jeff's research focuses on understanding physical processes in the coastal environment and linking those to the evolution of the coast over a range of timescales, among other subjects. Michael received his PhD from UWA and is currently a postdoctoral researcher there. Mike's research investigates nearshore processes and coastal hazards with a focus on complex rocky and reef-fronted coastlines. He's also interested in the drivers of coastal evolution at different timescales and how larger scale climate variability can impact these relationships. Both Jeff and Mike are longtime SoFar contacts and Spotter customers. Thanks so much for joining me to talk about your work, guys.
So just as a bit of a background, Western Australia is a pretty cool and pretty unique place. It's fully 1/3 of the Australian continent, but has a population of 2.7 million people, and most of those are pretty much in Perth, which is where Mike and I are now. It's a very diverse coastline, includes beautiful sandy beaches, lots of coral and rocky reefs, lots of different benthic habitats like seagrass meadows, macroalgae, and mangroves, and just some pretty nice photos of some of the cool field work we get to do in WA. And it's also a great place to do field work because the water is beautiful and clear. In terms of oceanography, Western Australia is also quite unique in the sense that we have really big gradients in waves and tides. So in tides, the south part of Western Australia is microtidal. So around where we are, the tide range is only about 50 centimeters. Whereas if you go to the north, the tide range is upwards of 6 or 8 meters in some of the largest tides in the world. And because of the Lewin current, which is a unique warm water current on the west coast of a continent, we also have really interesting sea level dynamics. So the Lewin current sort of starts often in the north of Australia and flows down the coast. But because again we're in the southern hemisphere, due to the Coriolis effect, the current deflects and is effectively trapped on the coast. And that means that we get pretty interesting sea level variability associated with changes in the strength of the Lewin current. So in that figure on the bottom, we can see that we have seasonal sea level variations that are on the order of 20 centimeters. And then we have a really strong interannual signal associated with ENSO. The effect is a teleconnection of the strength of the trade winds in the Pacific, modulating the strength of the Lewin current along Western Australia. So during La Niña conditions, we tend to get about an extra 10 centimeters of sea level, whereas the sea level is depressed during El Niño. And this is actually really quite interesting in terms of coastal processes because it gives us an opportunity to really have a sort of look of how coastlines respond to prolonged sea level variation, which provides an insight of what we can expect into the future of sea level rises. The southwest of Western Australia also is exposed to probably one of the most consistent wave climates in the world. And that's really just associated with the fact that we're directly facing most active portions of the Southern Ocean. So the storms essentially typically form sort of to the south of South Africa, move east across the Southern Ocean, and generate waves all along that way. And that provides a really interesting opportunity for us to look at coastal processes. And also is the south of Australia is really one of the prime potentially target areas for wave energy, which is something that we also work on here. So as Duncan said, we've really had a lot of use of spotters since sort of the very beginning. And that's really driven by a lot of the research that we do. So, Western Australia coastline is on the order of 10,000 kilometers long. And there's only a few wave buoys that are operated by the Western Australia Department of Transport. And really, in terms of doing research, I think most people would agree for coastal stuff, you need to know what the waves are doing. And so that's really driven us to figure out ways to collect more data. Historically, that was using sort of bottom-mounted ADCPs, but those can be fairly difficult to deploy and recover. You either need to have a vessel with lifting capability or do it by diving, which we do quite a bit. I sort of coming from the US, I didn't really realize how spoiled you are to have sort of direct access to all of the data in more or less real time from NDBC and CDIP and those networks that have buoys, pretty much everywhere. That really doesn't exist here. So we've sort of started doing some of that ourselves just to increase the data available. So we got one of the very first spotters when they first came out, and so far have done quite a lot of deployments across different events and environments. So starting in 2018, so right towards the end of 2018, 2019, we deployed a number of spotters and a data well Waverider for Albany wave energy projects. So Albany's on the south coast, the very southwest corner, and has been identified as globally a good potential development site for wave energy. And also around that time, we decided to make it easier for us to access our own data quickly. We developed a public-facing webpage, wawaves.org, that essentially displays all of our data and allows download. And then in 2019, we got a project funded by Australia's Integrated Marine Observing System to really test out some of the spotters in more detail. And so that included things like doing bucket tests, so submerging the buoy in a bucket just to see if we could replicate some of the data that we're seeing in the field when it's really windy, or if the mooring's tangled, to see what happens if the GPS momentarily loses GPS lock. So we've had a detailed look at that, and we're able to reproduce what we see in the field through this sort of simple bucket tests. Through that project also has included really detailed comparisons of spotters with Waveriders, so in different locations across the country, but sort of here showing just two comparisons based on comparing spectral measurements, starting with displacements directly at more than 13,000 hours at two sites in WA. So just looking at the wave parameters there on the right, and then we can also split that up across frequency to look at things how spreading and direction varies across the frequency space due to how these buoys operate somewhat differently. So the spotter obviously being a GNSS buoy compared to traditional accelerometer Waverider. So we've also been pretty early adopters of drifting deployments. We did our first drifting deployment in 2020, and we're actually, I'll show the trajectory of that in a little while, but we're actually really lucky in that one of the drifting buoys we deployed drifted straight back to Perth after about 6 months, which we were lucky, and Mike swam off the beach and recovered it. So as part of those drifting deployments, we've captured some really interesting events. So there was about a 1 in 10 year a storm in May of 2020 that formed when there was a tropical cyclone from the north that migrated south and merged with a very large cold front. And you can see sort of the visible satellite image there on the bottom left. And during that storm, we happened to have two drifting buoys that were both sitting about 500 kilometers off the coast, about 1,000 kilometers apart. And this storm had very large winds and waves over quite a big area. And those buoys were both simultaneously recording HSs in excess of 7 meters for about 24 hours or more. So that's an event that we're working up in terms to us, and it's been incredible to have these data available to us. I'll turn over to Mike now to talk about some of the other projects.
Yeah, so as Jeff mentioned earlier, we get some interesting ENSO-driven dynamics that you can see in our water level signal, but this also actually brings warm water down the coast as well, and has significant impacts for the WA coastal ecosystems. So West Australia has some very remote and pristine coral reefs. Most notably along the northwest, we have Ningaloo Reef, which is one of the world's largest fringing reef systems. And then we've got the remote atolls along the northwest shelf called the Rolly Shoals as well. And so we've had some of our most significant coral bleaching events that have occurred during previous La Niñas. And around this time is when we started integrating some of the SoFar smart moorings into our observation networks as well. And during the La Niña event, which I'll talk about a bit now, we over the course of a few months, we're able to generate this whole network that you can see in the bottom panel that combined our normal spotter buoys that just had surface measurements, as well as integrated some of these SoFar smart moorings at key locations around the coast. And so this was actually quite a rapid collaboration across UWA. Aqualink was just starting up so far, and then the Minderoo Foundation as well. And I think we were able to cover something like 500 kilometers in 5 days along the northwest shelf to deploy 8 of these smart moorings. And this was work that one of our PhD students, Camille Grimaldi, was really leading with myself. And so these were some of our earliest adoptions with the smart mooring, which brought a lot of learnings, especially trying to maintain these in remote areas, which really forced us to rely on some of the regional monitoring teams. So our parks and wildlife services who are out there, and they're the ones managing the reefs and whatnot, actually partnering up with them in order to, maintain these buoys and recover them when things potentially went wrong. Some other interesting observations that we've collected over the few years was the passage of Tropical Cyclone Saroja, which happened in April 2021. During this, we had this whole network for the heatwaves deployment. We had these 2 low pressure systems sort of come into being along the northwest shelf and then actually circle around each other, which is this meteorological effect called the Fujiwara effect. And so you can see in this GIF the merging of those 2 low pressure systems and eventually the formation of that tropical cyclone Saroja that came and impacted West Australia, sort of in the Midwest region. At this time, we had a variety of smart moorings, a drifting buoy, and one of our other spotters deployed. And through collaboration with SoFar and Aqualink, we were able to actually turn them all into full spectral waves mode, which was really cool and a great opportunity to really capture the full spectral characteristics of these storms as they pass by our network. In 2022, we've also been into our teaching units. So there's an annual field-based course that goes down to Albany in the Southwest that Jeff has been leading for the last couple of years. And we were able to deploy about 3 or 4 spotters with the students to get them, teaching them about how to design the moorings and get the buoys in the water, showing them how to monitor the data coming in real time, and then getting them to actually download the data, plot it up, and start using it to understand some of the nearshore dynamics in these systems. And lastly, if we're looking at right now and into the next couple of months, we've got 2 new drifting buoys in the water that were deployed off South Africa a few months ago. And this is a project that Jeff will be talking about in a few minutes. So kind of take a bit of time now to jump into a few notable projects that we've been working on, some ongoing and future work. Jeff mentioned our WA Waves platform. This was really something that we developed to facilitate wider uptake and usefulness of the wave data that we were collecting. It was initially driven by our own laziness and wanting to see everything in one place. But through conversations with community members wanting real-time data for either surfing or boating, as well as just having a way to actually download the data and provide it publicly to people. We set up this whole website, required a lot of coding on my part to grab the data in real time. We apply some real-time quality control to just remove some spikes that we can see, which were some of those GPS dropouts. And then we serve it up in just a readily accessible CSV download option. When the buoys are in spectral mode, we actually have a GIF that plays of the last few hours of the spectral evolution, which is pretty cool. So you can actually see some of the different swell patterns moving in, which our surf friends on the South Coast are always stoked to see. And then there's been sort of wider growing use of spotters around Australia in general. So we've got partners based in Victoria and South Australia as well, each that are developing their own networks. And so we've been able to share this platform to allow them to actually also serve up the data in a consistent manner as well. Something else that I've been working on recently, which has been sort of a side project, is looking at using the smart moorings into real-time observations and forecasts for coastal hazards. So the South Coast is very popular for rock fishing. You get a lot of really good fishing species that come in close to shore, and people like to stand on the rocks to get right into them. So it brings a lot of people down to that area for recreational purposes, but as we've shown, it's also has some of the largest waves as well. And so you can get these extreme wave run-up events that happen and can just totally wash out the rock fishing spots. One of the most popular ones is this place called Salmon Holes that just brings a huge crowd every salmon fishing season, which is April for us here. And they've had a few deaths over the last 10 to 15 years of fishers just being washed off the rocks. And although there are tie points for harnesses and safety life vests and things like that, some of these accidents still happen. And so we've been trying to work with the local government and management agencies down there to investigate the drivers of the run-up events so that we can potentially provide sort of short-term forecasts of what the hazard might be at any given time. And so to do this, we've got a pressure sensor deployed at about 30 meters. And then we've got a coastal camera set up. And one other project that is really just starting to ramp up right now and is also going to be relying on smart moorings is a new project that's looking at advancing our prediction of the WA marine heat waves. And so this is a really large, hugely collaborative project and multidisciplinary as well. And it involves, I think, every West Australian university, as well as our primary state management agencies, the Department of Primary Industries, Research and Development, which is fisheries, and then our Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions, which is basically our marine park management agency. And it also integrates with the federal agency, the Bureau of Meteorology, which is already doing sort of seasonal heat wave forecasts as well for coral bleaching around Australia. And so this project is specifically focused on the West Australian marine heat wave events, and we're targeting sort of the key areas where our target fisheries are, as well as those coral reefs, seagrass, and other sensitive habitats happen to be. And we'll be combining with our management agency's long-term nearshore temperature measurements. We'll be adding to that sort of cross-shore transects of smart moorings, which will have them deployed in about 50 meters depth and 35 meters depth as well. So we'll get this good image of what the surface and subsurface temperature is doing, with the aim of developing both statistical downsailing techniques to look at sort of the nearshore temperature climates. And then for select sites, we'll be trying to actually use high-res numerical models to understand the fine-scale temperature variability within some of these specific ecosystems. And so some of this was actually motivated by that initial 2021 deployment that kind of gave a bit of confidence in using the smart moorings around the West Australian coastline. And so we've actually got about 6 in the workshop right now and another 6 coming, and we're looking to do all these deployments, I think, starting in about October. So it'll be a bunch more data coming in. It'll be a really exciting time to see what all this is going to do.
All right, and just to finish up, we're really going to be looking at developing and applying data assimilation methods to improve swell forecast, initially focused on Australia's northwest shelf. So there's a lot of industry and marine shipping off the northwest shelf due to resources and just increasingly renewables as well. And as I've learned over the last couple of years, the ships, because they're so large, are preferentially sensitive to swell because it can cause them to resonate, and it can cause a lot of safety or equipment damage issues. And so a persistent issue that they've had on the Northwest Shelf, and is actually an issue with forecasts globally, is with swell, particularly on getting the arrival time correct, as well as the amplitude of that swell. And so, for example, if a swell arrives 6 or 12 hours early, which isn't that uncommon, and a shipload is underway, for example, that can actually cause conditions to become quite unsafe if that vessel starts to resonate. So what we're essentially doing is really actually building on a lot of the work that's been done by the SoFar team to develop assimilation techniques. And initially, this will be applied using drifting buoys that we've also deployed. This is just from the last couple of years. And then also we have these ones that we deployed over the last couple of months, thanks to a research cruise by the South African Meteorological Service, who kindly deployed these 2 buoys for us on a ship from Cape Town to Marion Island. And they're behaving very nicely and drifting east into the Indian Ocean, into the swell track, which is hopefully where they'll be in a couple of months' time. And so far, I've also been great and are sharing their data from the global network that they have, and we'll be using these data to really develop and apply these assimilation techniques to try to initially really focus on improving swell forecasts on Australia's Northwest Shelf. And as a key other output of this project, we're really aiming to inform sort of the optimal placement, potentially of longer term networks of drifting buoys, such that we can provide a simulation framework that really reduces uncertainty in swell, particularly on Australia's Northwest Shelf, and a framework that can be applied elsewhere.
So now we'll jump into the Q&A session. Here we have one from Merlin. What satellite services do you use for the real-time data transmission? We use Iridium satellite for this. And I'll follow up with another question here. So Mike, I've seen you guys develop the smart moorings, and then compare the temperature measurements to satellite readings. Can you talk a little bit about this new temperature monitoring project and what you're doing to compare the temperature variability observed by satellites with the in-situ measurements?
Yeah, sure. So so that GIF that we showed a few slides back was actually comparing some of the smart mooring surface measurement data with NOAA's Coral Reef Watch 5-kilometer product, which is probably one of the more common products that's used, especially in sort of the marine ecology world, for really assessing bleaching stress and ecosystem impacts, I would say. And so I think a lot of the satellite products have been trained and developed in association with a lot of the existing observations as well, but you still tend to see offsets that could be due to spatial resolution, different sort of interpolation techniques that are happening. As well as we've noticed in WA, especially, that there's just some areas, again, potentially due to the footprint of the satellite, where the satellite products just totally break down. And so one of the goals with this new project is to target some of those areas and really try to understand, the drivers of the heat budgets in these areas, and potentially develop corrections to the satellites that will actually give us, better understanding of what's happening, and either let you use that downscaling technique to apply elsewhere, or just gain a better understanding of that exact area that we're looking at.
Awesome, thanks. We have another question from Teddy Allen. Have you guys had experience with vandalism or buoys going missing given their small size? Also, what are some of the biggest challenges in deployment and data delivery?
Actually, probably a bit less than I would have expected. Hopefully I don't regret saying that, but yeah, we haven't had too bad. I mean, you definitely have to pay attention in coastal areas to where you put them, and we put a lot of effort into trying to purposely kind of avoid areas that we think that might be, on the popular boating routes or things like that. I think some of our colleagues in Victoria may have had a few more issues, but really it's probably less vandalism and more inadvertent vessel strikes.
Yeah.
I think some of the challenges is, we've put a lot of effort into designing moorings here at UWA, which I didn't really talk about at all, but so I think that can probably be one of the biggest effects on the data quality, but also just in terms of longevity of the deployment, you really need to use high quality components and really think about the mooring. And we have had definitely some challenges, like we've had a deployment off Darwin, so in actually the Northern Territory, where the tide range is massive and the currents are really strong. So it's really probably just thinking about all of that. Like another deployment we did was in 350 meters depth in a submarine canyon off Perth. It's actually right in the core of the Lewin Current. And so that was really challenging. And the first one that we put out there, quite frankly, the mooring wasn't up to snuff, and it caused the buoy to basically be submerged.
When you're deploying these drifting buoys, could you explain a bit, like what do the spectral observations, how do they allow you to better predict swell arrival times? Can you go into that a bit more?
Well, so I think that one of the biggest issues is that, in Western Australia, most of the wave buoys that we have there that are in sort of depths that are on the order of 50 meters or something, give or take. So you're not really measuring that open ocean swell. So when you compare it with like a global wave model product, you're kind of in most instances too close to the coast. And so I think for us, like NOAA in the US, operates the California buoy and the Papa buoy, and operating and maintaining those buoys is unbelievably expensive. And so the drifting buoys, it's really an incredible opportunity for us to essentially, for a relatively small cost, collect open ocean, like truly open ocean, hundreds of kilometers from the coast, spectral observations, which you just otherwise wouldn't be able to get. I mean, so, with synthetic aperture radar and some other satellite products, you're starting to be able to get spectra from satellites, but it's still not quite the same as a wave buoy that's sending full spectral data back every hour.
One other question, Mike, I had for you was how does the having the temperature data from the smart moorings in real time help you with kind of decision making around when to go out and survey sites or something like this versus just having it on loggers?
Yeah, so that's something we've definitely been working a lot more with our the DBCA team, which is the Marine Park Management Agency here. And so some of the 2021 data was at those remote atolls, the Rolly Shoals. And the previous year, right, we had like 2020 to 2023 was back to back La Niñas pretty much. And the Rollies is one of the rare reefs in WA that pretty much has almost never experienced significant bleaching. And in 2020, it was peak COVID and everybody was really like, locked down, we couldn't do anything. And we were getting all these bleaching alerts, and we were lucky to get a team to actually go out and do a survey. And they reported, pretty minor bleaching and everything recovered. But after that, in 2021, they were really happy watching everything develop, that we had the live data. It never got hot enough to trigger anything. But yeah, they've all been finding it really useful, again, because of the difference in the resolution between the satellites and then the actual reef scale temperature dynamics. Having those real-time observations in situ is super helpful for whether they mobilize to some of these remote areas to actually go do a survey or not. And I think as these start, longer term online, we've had a couple of hiccups with actually maintaining these consistently that I think we're smoothing out. I do think they're going to be part of their active temperature monitoring programs and stuff moving forward.
like what is the end state for the density of observations, and like what threshold do you want to reach in order to benefit the data consumers, or is there other things that you're worried about before, kind of scaling up, as far as like the usefulness of the data to different user groups?
Yeah. Well, I mean, ultimately, the drawback with almost any in situ measurement is spatial scale, right? You have excellent resolution in time, but generally poor resolution in space. And so I think, we're probably taking the approach that many people take, and that essentially you combine your in situ observations with most likely numerical modeling, or potentially other like remote sense measurements as well. So, I don't really ever see us having 500 wave buoys deployed at any one time. But I think it's really trying to put the thought into deploying them to get the most out of the fewest that you can have, basically, and using that advantage of the high resolution in time, in the detail in the data, for example, like with the spectrum, to use that to your advantage, right? Because getting the spectra in terms of any kind of modeling, where you have swell and some other kind of simultaneous sea state, if you don't have the spectra for that, your ability to understand or model it is just very limited. So yeah, so I think for us, getting the spectra, at least for the waves, is very key. And then another thing that with the smart moorings, that while a lot of the partners that we have been mostly interested in temperature, I think here we're probably lean more towards the water level measurements, because we're quite interested in looking at those sea level dynamics that I showed. And obviously, by having a pressure sensor sitting there, you're able to essentially get, what is that non-tidal residual at any point in time.
Thank you for that answer. And I'm not seeing a ton more. I see a few more on why don't I see the spotters from the Wavewaves network on the SoFar website. And that's basically the buoys that you see on the weather dashboard are the drifting buoys that are maintained by SoFar. We deploy those and perform data assimilation and run our own models. So those are our own. We don't put customer data or customer buoys on the SoFar weather dashboard. Yeah, I want to thank you both for taking the time to give this talk, and thank everyone for joining, and we'll see you next time.